The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as Sergeant Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red uniform for what felt like the 1,000th time. At 52 years old, he had been serving as a Queen's Guard for over 2 decades, standing motionless for hours while tourists snapped photos and tried to make him smile or react. His weathered face had seen countless seasons change, witnessed historical moments, and endured the passing of his beloved Queen Elizabeth II just months earlier. Thomas had always taken pride in his duty, but lately, something felt different. The weight of his tall black bearskin hat seemed heavier, and the silence during his shifts felt more profound. His wife Sarah had noticed the change too. She would find him staring out their kitchen window in the evenings, lost in thoughts he couldn't quite put into words. The castle felt different now, filled with new routines and faces, though the traditions remained the same. That particular Tuesday morning, Thomas received his assignment for the day. He would be stationed at the main entrance, where the royal family often passed through on their way to various engagements. As he took his position, he noticed the groundskeepers preparing the gardens with extra care. The head gardener mentioned that the young Prince George would be visiting later with his tutor for a history lesson about the castle's heritage. Thomas had seen Prince George before, of course, but always from a distance during formal ceremonies. The boy was now 10 years old with his father's serious demeanor, but his mother's gentle eyes. As the hours passed, Thomas maintained his rigid posture, his mind wandering to his own grandson, Jamie, who was about the same age as the prince. Jamie lived in Scotland with Thomas's daughter, and their visits had become less frequent since his wife's recent illness. The afternoon air was crisp when Thomas heard familiar voices approaching. Prince George walked alongside his tutor, Mrs. Henderson, asking questions about the castle's architecture and the history of the guards. The boy's curiosity was evident as he pointed to different features of the building, his school uniform neat but his hair slightly tousled from the autumn breeze. As they passed by Thomas's position, Prince George suddenly stopped. He had noticed something that his tutor hadn't, a small, almost imperceptible tremor in the guard's hand. It was barely visible, but the observant child had caught it. Mrs. Henderson continued walking, expecting the prince to follow, but George remained still, studying Thomas with the kind of intense focus that only children possess. The moment stretched between them, guard and prince both frozen in their respective roles, yet somehow connected by an unspoken understanding. Thomas could feel the boy's gaze, though he couldn't acknowledge it. His training demanded complete stillness, but inside, he wondered what thoughts were running through the young prince's mind. Neither of them knew that this brief encounter would soon transform into something much more meaningful than a simple passing moment in the castle courtyard. Prince George's sharp eyes had caught something his tutor missed entirely. While Mrs. Henderson discussed the historical significance of the guard uniforms, the young prince noticed that Sergeant Mitchell's left hand was shaking slightly. It wasn't the normal stillness that people expected from the Queen's Guards. There was something more human about it, something that reminded George of his own grandfather during his final days. The boy had always been naturally empathetic, a trait his parents had nurtured carefully. During family dinners, he would often ask about the staff members they encountered, wondering about their families and lives beyond the palace walls. His mother, Catherine, had taught him that kindness was one of the most important qualities a future king could possess, while his father, William, had shared stories about the dedicated people who served the royal family with unwavering loyalty. Mrs. Henderson finally noticed that her young charge had stopped walking. She turned back with a patient smile, accustomed to George's tendency to become absorbed in observing the world around him. "Your Royal Highness, we should continue with our tour. We still have the state apartments to visit before tea time," she gently reminded him. But George remained focused on the guard. He tilted his head slightly, studying Thomas's face with the kind of innocent directness that adults often find both charming and unsettling. The prince had learned about the guards in his history lessons, how they stood for hours without moving, protecting the royal family through their dedication and discipline. Yet here was clear evidence that beneath the uniform was a real person, someone who might be struggling with something difficult. "Mrs. Henderson," George said quietly, his voice carrying the careful politeness he had been taught. "Do the guards ever get breaks during their duty?" It seemed like an innocent question from a curious child, but Thomas could hear something deeper in the boy's tone. There was genuine concern there, a quality that surprised the experienced soldier. Mrs. Henderson explained the rotation schedule, how guards changed positions every few hours, and the importance of maintaining discipline during their watch. As she spoke, George continued to watch Thomas, noticing small details that others might miss. The way the man's breathing seemed slightly labored, how his usually perfect posture had the tiniest hint of fatigue, and, most importantly, that subtle tremor that seemed to come and go. The prince had recently learned about his great-grandmother's final months, how even the strongest people sometimes faced challenges that weren't immediately visible to others. His parents had explained that being royal meant understanding that everyone, regardless of their position, deserved compassion and respect. This lesson was about to manifest in a way that would surprise everyone present. Thomas, meanwhile, was fighting an internal battle. The tremor in his hand was new, something that had started after his wife's recent diagnosis. The stress of her condition, combined with the physical demands of his duty and the emotional weight of serving during this transitional time for the monarchy, had begun to take its toll. He had hoped no one would notice, that his decades of training would carry him through this difficult period, without anyone being aware of his personal struggles. The moment that would change everything began with the simplest of gestures. Prince George, after observing Thomas for several minutes, did something completely unexpected. He reached into his small leather school bag and pulled out a bottle of water and a packet of biscuits that his nanny had packed for his afternoon snack. Without saying a word, he walked directly up to the guard and placed both items on the ground near Thomas's feet. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened in surprise. This wasn't part of any protocol she knew, and she wasn't sure how to respond. The young prince had just broken an unspoken rule about interacting with the guards during their duty. She opened her mouth to gently correct him, but something in George's expression made her pause. There was such sincerity in his actions that she found herself curious about what would happen next. Thomas stared straight ahead, as his training demanded, but his heart was racing. In all his years of service, nothing like this had ever happened. Tourists had tried various antics to get reactions from him, but this was different. This wasn't a game or a test of his discipline. This was pure kindness from a child who had somehow sensed that he needed support. The prince stepped back a respectful distance and spoke in a clear, gentle voice that carried remarkable maturity for a 10-year-old. "I know you can't move right now, but my mom always says that everyone needs looking after sometimes. When my great-grandmother was unwell, small acts of kindness meant the most to her. I thought maybe you might be thirsty or hungry after standing for so long." Mrs. Henderson felt her own eyes beginning to water. She had been tutoring royal children for 15 years, but she had never witnessed such spontaneous compassion. The prince hadn't been prompted or coached. This gesture came entirely from his own observation and natural empathy. She realized she was witnessing the development of exactly the kind of character the nation would one day need in a king. Other staff members who were passing by had begun to notice the unusual scene. A groundskeeper paused in his work, leaning on his rake as he watched. A housemaid carrying fresh linen stopped in the corridor that overlooked the courtyard. Word began to spread quietly among the castle staff that something touching was happening near the main entrance. Thomas's throat tightened with emotion. The gesture was so pure, so unexpected, that it cut through all his professional barriers. Here was this young boy, who would one day inherit an enormous responsibility, taking time to care for someone he barely knew. The water and biscuits weren't just refreshments, they were symbols of recognition, acknowledgement that Thomas was a human being deserving of care and consideration. The guard's vision began to blur slightly as tears formed in his eyes. He had spent decades training himself to show no emotion, to be a living statue representing duty and service. But this moment was testing every ounce of his self-control. The kindness was overwhelming, especially coming at a time when his personal life felt so uncertain and challenging. Prince George seemed to understand that he shouldn't expect a response. He had learned enough about royal protocol to know that guards maintained their positions regardless of external circumstances. Instead, he simply smiled warmly and said, "Please take care of yourself. My family is grateful for everything you do to keep us safe." Then he turned to rejoin Mrs. Henderson, who was struggling to maintain her own composure. The tears that Thomas had been fighting finally escaped, rolling down his weathered cheeks despite every fiber of his training telling him to maintain composure. 23 years of discipline of standing perfectly still through rain, snow, scorching heat, and bitter cold suddenly felt insignificant compared to this moment of pure human connection. The young prince's words had touched something deep within him that he hadn't even realized was wounded. Mrs. Henderson watched in amazement as more staff members began to gather at a respectful distance. The head butler, who had been walking past with the afternoon mail, stopped when he saw the scene unfolding. A senior housemaid pressed her hand to her heart, clearly moved by what she was witnessing. Even the castle's head of security, a stern man who rarely showed emotion, seemed affected by the genuine display of compassion. Prince George, meanwhile, seemed completely unaware of the attention his gesture had attracted. He was focused entirely on the guard, his young face showing concern for Thomas's obvious emotional response. The boy had learned about empathy from his parents, but this was perhaps the first time he had seen his actions have such a profound impact on another person. It was a powerful lesson in the weight that kindness could carry. Thomas tried desperately to regain his composure, but the combination of stress from his wife's illness, the pressure of adapting to changes in the royal household, and now this unexpected moment of grace had overwhelmed his usual defenses. His shoulders began to shake slightly as he struggled to contain the emotions that were flooding through him. The items at his feet seemed to glow with significance, simple objects transformed into symbols of human decency. Mrs. Henderson made a decision that would later be discussed among the royal household staff for years to come. Instead of hurrying Prince George away from what could be seen as an awkward situation, she chose to honor the moment. She approached Thomas slowly and spoke in a gentle voice that carried both respect and warmth. "Sergeant Mitchell, His Royal Highness Prince George would like you to know that your service is deeply appreciated, not just as a guard, but as a person." The use of his name startled Thomas. In his years of service, he had become accustomed to being seen as part of the scenery, a living piece of the castle's furniture. To be acknowledged as an individual, especially by name and in front of the young prince, felt revolutionary. His tears flowed more freely now, and he no longer tried to hide them. The human being inside the uniform had been recognized and honored. Prince George stepped forward once more, his natural instincts overriding any concerns about protocol. He looked up at Thomas with those kind eyes that reminded everyone who met him of his mother's compassionate nature. "My father told me that the bravest people are those who protect others, even when they're facing their own battles. Thank you for being brave for our family every day." The words hit Thomas like a physical force. How had this child, this 10-year-old boy, managed to understand exactly what he needed to hear? The prince couldn't have known about Sarah's illness, about the sleepless nights spent worrying about her treatment, about the fear that had been gnawing at him for weeks. Yet somehow George had offered precisely the acknowledgement and encouragement that Thomas's heart desperately craved. News of the extraordinary encounter spread through Windsor Castle like wildfire, but in the respectful hushed tones that characterized royal household communications. The head butler, Mr. Whitmore, who had served the family for over 30 years, found himself deeply moved as he relayed the story to other senior staff members. He had witnessed many touching moments during his tenure, but this felt different, more authentic and spontaneous than the carefully orchestrated charitable events that were part of royal routine. Within hours, the story had reached Prince William and Catherine. When Mrs. Henderson provided her detailed account of the afternoon's events, both parents exchanged a look of pride mixed with concern. They were proud of their son's instinctive compassion, but they also understood the profound responsibility that came with such gestures. Catherine, in particular, felt her heart swell with maternal satisfaction. The values they had tried so hard to instill in George were clearly taking root in meaningful ways. Prince William made an unusual decision. Instead of simply acknowledging the incident and moving on, he asked to meet with Sergeant Mitchell personally. This wasn't standard protocol, but William had learned from his grandmother that sometimes the most important leadership moments happened outside of formal structures. He wanted to understand what had prompted his son's actions and ensure that Thomas felt properly supported by the royal family. Meanwhile, Thomas had been relieved of his duties for the remainder of the day. His commanding officer, Major Harrison, had recognized that the emotional impact of the encounter had made it impossible for the sergeant to continue his post with the required composure. Rather than viewing this as a failure of discipline, Harrison saw it as evidence of the profound humanity that existed within even the most professional soldiers. Thomas sat in the guards' common room, still processing what had happened. Fellow guards who had heard about the incident approached him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Sergeant Davies, who had served alongside Thomas for over a decade, placed a comforting hand on his friend's shoulder. "That young prince has a good heart," he said simply. "Sometimes children see things that adults miss entirely." The water bottle and packet of biscuits had been carefully preserved by Mrs. Henderson, who understood their symbolic importance. She had placed them in a small wooden box in her office, thinking that perhaps they might be returned to Prince George as a keepsake, or kept as a reminder of a moment when protocol gave way to pure human kindness. As evening approached, Thomas received an unexpected message. Prince William requested his presence in the private study, not for any disciplinary reason but for a personal conversation. The invitation filled Thomas with a mixture of anxiety and honor. In all his years of service, he had never had a private audience with a senior member of the royal family outside of formal ceremonies or briefings. When Thomas arrived at the appointed time, he found Prince William waiting with a warm expression that immediately put him at ease. The future king had removed his jacket and loosened his tie, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a conversation between two fathers than a meeting between a royal and his employee. On the desk between them sat the water bottle and biscuits that George had offered earlier in the day. "Sergeant Mitchell," William began, his voice carrying genuine warmth, "I wanted to speak with you personally about what happened today. My son came home quite affected by your encounter, and Catherine and I felt it was important that we understand the full context of his actions." The prince paused, studying Thomas's face with the same perceptive intensity that his son had shown earlier. Thomas found himself in the surreal position of sharing his personal struggles with the future King of England. The formal barriers that normally existed between them seemed to dissolve as William's genuine concern became apparent. With hesitant words, Thomas began to explain about his wife Sarah's recent cancer diagnosis, the sleepless nights spent researching treatments, and the way worry had begun to affect his physical well-being. Prince William listened with the kind of focused attention that made Thomas understand why the royal family commanded such loyalty from their staff. There were no interruptions, no glances at watches or phones, just complete presence and empathy. William shared his own experiences with loss and worry, particularly the difficult period following his mother's death and, more recently, his grandfather's passing. The conversation became a bridge between two men facing life's challenges, regardless of their different stations. "George has always been sensitive to others' emotions," William explained, his voice filled with paternal pride. "But what he did today was extraordinary even for him. He came home asking dozens of questions about the guards, about whether they have families who worry about them, whether they ever feel scared or sad while they're working." The prince smiled softly. "Catherine and I realized that he had recognized something in you that he connected with on a very human level." Thomas felt a fresh wave of emotion as he understood the depth of the young prince's perception. George hadn't just noticed his physical distress. He had somehow sensed the emotional burden that Thomas was carrying. The boy's gesture hadn't been a simple act of politeness taught by royal protocol. It had been an authentic response to human suffering that he had witnessed and wanted to alleviate. William reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a handwritten letter on royal stationery. "George asked me to give this to you," he said, sliding the envelope across the desk. "He spent over an hour writing it this evening, asking Catherine to help him spell some of the words correctly." Thomas accepted the letter with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. The letter, written in careful 10-year-old handwriting, was brief but profound. George had written about how he had learned that being strong didn't mean never feeling worried or sad, but rather continuing to do important work even when life felt difficult. He thanked Thomas for protecting his family and expressed hope that whatever was troubling him would get better soon. At the bottom, he had drawn a small picture of a guard standing proudly in front of Windsor Castle, with the sun shining brightly overhead. William watched as Thomas read the letter, seeing the impact of his son's words reflected in the veteran soldier's expression. "The royal family has always depended on the dedication of people like you, Sergeant Mitchell. But sometimes I think we forget to acknowledge that this dedication comes from real people, with real lives and real challenges. George reminded us of that today. The prince then made an offer that surprised Thomas completely. The royal family wanted to ensure that Sarah received the best possible medical care, and they were prepared to arrange for her treatment at one of London's premier cancer centers. It wasn't charity, William explained, but recognition of the sacrifice that military families made in service to the crown. Thomas felt overwhelmed by the generosity, but more than that, he was moved by the genuine care that was being shown to him and his wife. As their conversation drew to a close, William stood and extended his hand to Thomas. "Thank you for your years of service, and thank you for helping my son learn an important lesson about leadership today. Sometimes the most powerful thing a future king can learn is how to recognize and respond to human need with spontaneous kindness." 6 months later, Thomas stood once again at his post near Windsor Castle's main entrance, but everything had changed. Sarah's treatment had been successful. The cancer caught early enough for a complete recovery. The medical team that Prince William had arranged had been exceptional, providing not just cutting-edge treatment, but also the kind of comprehensive care that had eased the entire family's anxiety during those difficult months. More importantly, Thomas's relationship with his role had been transformed. He no longer saw himself as merely a decorative element of royal tradition, but as a valued member of the extended family that truly cared about his well-being. The tremor in his hand had disappeared along with the stress that had caused it, and his posture once again reflected the pride and dignity that had defined his career. Prince George, now 11 years old, had continued his regular visits to various parts of the castle for his education. Whenever his path took him near Thomas's post, he would offer a discreet nod of acknowledgement, never enough to disrupt the formal protocols, but sufficient to maintain the human connection they had established. Mrs. Henderson had noted in her reports that these encounters seemed to energize both the prince and the guard, creating positive moments in both of their routines. The story of that autumn afternoon had become something of a legend among the royal household staff, shared with new employees as an example of the values that the family truly embodied. It had also influenced how the royal family approached their relationships with staff members, leading to new initiatives focused on supporting the well-being of those who served the crown. Prince William had established a discreet assistance program for household staff facing personal crises. Inspired by his son's intuitive understanding of human need, Thomas often reflected on how a simple gesture from a child had rippled outward to create positive change for many people. He had framed Prince George's letter and kept it in his locker, reading it whenever he needed a reminder of why his service mattered. The drawing of the guard standing proudly in the sunshine had become a symbol of hope during his darkest moments with Sarah's illness. On quiet afternoons when tourists were few and the castle felt peaceful, Thomas sometimes smiled thinking about the impact that one moment of genuine compassion had created. Prince George had taught him that strength wasn't about maintaining perfect composure at all times, but about being open to receiving help and kindness when it was offered. The young prince had also learned valuable lessons about the power of noticing others' needs and responding with authentic care, rather than formal obligation. The water bottle and packet of biscuits, carefully preserved by Mrs. Henderson, had eventually been returned to Prince George as a keepsake. He kept them in his bedroom as a reminder of the day he had learned that being royal meant more than following protocols. It meant using his position to recognize and support the humanity in everyone around him. Catherine and William often pointed to this incident when discussing with their son the true meaning of leadership and service. As Thomas continued his watch that day, he noticed a familiar figure approaching with Mrs. Henderson. Prince George, now taller and more confident, but retaining that same observant kindness in his eyes, was returning from another history lesson. As he passed by Thomas's position, he paused for just a moment and spoke quietly enough that only the guard could hear. "I hope you and Mrs. Mitchell are both well, Sergeant. Thank you for everything you continue to do for our family." Then he continued on his way, leaving Thomas with a renewed sense of purpose and a heart full of gratitude for the extraordinary compassion of a young prince who had seen beyond a uniform to the person beneath.